They called it the Fool's Stove, and they called her worse. A Japanese woman named Kimiko built a clay dome in the middle of her cabin floor, right where every man in Cottonwood Creek said a stove had no business being. They told her the clay would shatter in the first hard frost, and the pine floor would catch beneath it. She kept building, and she kept her silence, and she kept one lacquered trunk shut the whole time. When the winter storm of 1883 locked the territory in ice for 3 days, the only warm hearth left in the valley was the one they had laughed at. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Late October of 1883, and the wind had already started down out of the Wyoming mountains, carrying the smell of snow that hadn't fallen yet. The buckboard came into Cottonwood Creek at the hour when the light turns amber and the kerosene lamps in the general store begin to matter. A rancher didn't send a carriage for a bride, because a carriage was a fragile thing built for passengers and not for hauling a woman and her goods across a territory road. Tucker Wade had sent a buckboard, the pickup of its day, and it carried one woman and one lacquered trunk and nothing else. The trunk would matter most of all. The town saw her before she saw the town. 3 men on the store porch set down their cups and didn't pick them back up because they had expected a mail-order bride out of the catalogs, and what they got was a small-framed Japanese woman sitting straight on the hardboard with her hands folded in her lap. Her hair was jet black and pinned in a traditional Japanese knot, and her face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of her shawl. She wore a kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat, and she would never wear Western clothes, because the garment was the last piece of the country she'd left, and she wasn't going to take it off for strangers. The men on the porch didn't know what a kimono was, and they didn't know what a Japanese woman was, and so they called her what they had words for. One of them said she was the China woman, because the West hadn't yet learned to tell one people from another across the sea, and the mistake wasn't cruelty so much as ignorance with a cruel edge. Kimiko heard it, and she didn't turn her head, because she'd learned long before she crossed the ocean that a stranger saves her face by not giving it away. She had practice at that. Tucker met her where the road ended and the ruts began. A tall man with a burned brown face and hands that had built every fence on his place, he'd sent for a wife the way a man sends for seed, expecting something that would take root and grow. He helped her down from the buckboard without speaking, and she let him, and the lack of words between them wasn't cold so much as careful. The lacquered trunk he lifted with one arm and set in the bed of the wagon, and didn't ask what was inside it, because a man who has waited a year for a wife knows enough not to start with questions. The drive out to his cabin took the rest of the daylight, and the valley opened up around them in long brown grass and gray creek water, and the cabin stood alone at the base of a low ridge with a barn behind it and a windbreak of cottonwoods that gave the creek its name. It was one room of rough pine, a single window on the south wall, a door that didn't hang square, and a cold iron cook stove shoved against the north wall where the chimney drew the worst. Beside it sat a hearth built by a man in a hurry, and the draft pulled smoke into the room as often as it pulled it out. The cabin wasn't ready for her. The silence on the drive hadn't been the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It had been the silence of 2 people taking each other's measure across a distance neither knew how to close, she reading the country the way she read a stranger's face, he reading her the way he read a new horse. The valley was wide and empty, and the sky above it was the kind of sky that makes a person feel small. She had felt small under it, and she hadn't let her face show it. A woman who's crossed an ocean to marry a man she's never met has already decided what she will and won't show, and what she won't show is fear. The territory winter didn't negotiate. A cabin built for summer was a coffin by January if the heat couldn't hold, and Tucker's place had been built by a man who hadn't yet survived a winter in it. Kimiko had survived 13 of them in a house that never let the cold inside, and the difference between her memory and this room was the difference between a home and a shelter. Kimiko walked the floor that first night while Tucker slept, and she didn't unpack her clothes, and she didn't open the trunk. She knelt beside the iron stove and laid her palm flat on its side and felt the metal already pulling heat out of her hand, even with no fire lit. Then she understood what she had to build, and she understood that no one in this valley would believe her until it saved them. The trunk stayed shut against the wall, and the lamp threw its flickering amber light across the lacquer, and she didn't look at it again before she slept. Sleep came slowly. Morning came, gray and thin. Kimiko refused the iron stove against the north wall the way a woman refuses a door that opens onto a drop, and she walked to the center of the room with a piece of charcoal and marked a square on the bare pine floor. She marked it 3 feet on a side, and she didn't ask anyone's permission to mark it. Tucker watched her from the doorway, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he didn't stop her, because he hadn't yet found the words, and she hadn't yet given him cause. She spent the morning at the creek bank, digging clay, and carrying it up the slope in a wooden pail, mixing it with straw and sand on a flat stone until it turned the color and texture of something she recognized. By noon, she had begun to build a low clay dome in the dead center of the cabin, right where a man walks to get from the door to the bed, and she built it the way her hands remembered, not the way a plan would tell her. The work had a patience to it that didn't match the cold wind outside or the shortness of the daylight. The cold wouldn't wait for her to finish. The clay at the creek bank was the right kind, gray and dense, the kind that holds together in a squeezed fist and doesn't crumble back to dust. She had checked 3 bends of the creek before she found it, walking the bank in her trail coat with her skirts hiked above the mud, and Tucker had watched her choose the clay the way he'd watch a man choose a horse, by feel and by instinct and by something that looked like luck but wasn't. She hauled enough for 2 stoves, because she'd learned as a girl that the first firing of a clay stove sometimes takes a piece of the dome with it, and a woman who builds only enough clay for one is a woman who has to walk back to the creek in the cold. Better to carry too much than too little. Tucker set down his cup and asked her what it was. She said one word, Kamado, and didn't translate it, because the word would mean nothing to him until the stove taught him what it meant. He stood over the half-built dome and pointed at the things he could see going wrong with his own eyes. A stove in the walkway meant a man would stub his boot on it in the dark. Wood under fire was an old enemy on the frontier. Clay would crack, as clay always cracked, and the cabin would fill with smoke, while the tin pipe had nowhere to go from the center of the room because the chimney was built into the north wall. He wasn't cruel when he said it. A man who'd seen fire take a neighbor's barn the year before. He was afraid in the way that a careful man is afraid, with reasons, and he listed the problems the way a man lists the rounds in a revolver, counting them out on his fingers, and every one of them was a real problem. The frontier had taught him that a stove in the wrong place was a fire, looking for a place to happen, and he'd helped dig through the ashes of enough cabins to trust the lesson. She listened to all of it, and didn't argue with any of it because he was right about the dangers and wrong about the stove, and the only way to show him the difference was to build past his objections one by one. She answered each objection the way a builder answers, not with words, but with a single adjustment that made the objection smaller. A bed of flat river stones went under the base to keep the fire off the pine, and she drew the vent plan in the ash with her finger, a lower draft to feed the fire and a top vent to let the smoke climb. Then she showed him how the 2 openings would let her hold the heat, or release it like a valve, and she left a gap in the dome for a tin pipe to angle up and out through the roof at the angle that would keep the draft pulling out instead of back. The build would speak for itself. She wasn't guessing at any of it. She had built this stove in a kitchen across the ocean, and she had built it in the house he grew up in, and her hands knew the work the way his hands knew a rope. The trouble was that he didn't know her hands yet, and she didn't know how to prove them except by letting them work. Water traveled in a small valley, the way smoke travels from a single chimney, and by the next morning there was a horse tied outside the cabin, and a neighbor on the porch who'd ridden over to see the fool's stove with his own eyes. The trunk against the wall was still shut, and Kimiko still hadn't opened it since the day she arrived. The neighbor was Jed Calloway, and he was the closest thing Cottonwood Creek had to a foreman, the man the others looked to when a decision had to be made about a fence, or a well, or a storm. He rode over because Tucker's wife was building something wrong in the middle of her floor, and wrong things on the frontier had a way of becoming everyone's problem. Arms crossed and hat pushed back, he walked around the half-built Kamado and told Tucker straight, without softening it, that the thing would kill them both before Christmas. He said it like a fact. He had seen clay-lined wells cave in at the first hard rain, and adobe ovens 2 valleys over shatter in the first deep frost, the whole dome splitting open like a dropped plate. And he remembered the cabin on the cottonwood that burned to the ground because a man ran his stovepipe wrong and the sparks found the rafters. None of it was invented to sound wise, because he was reading from a list of funerals he'd attended. There had been the Peterson boy over on Slaty Creek, burned when a cook stove vent gave out and the coals rolled onto the floor in the night. And there had been the Trask place, where a clay oven built by a woman from the old country had cracked along a seam in the first real cold and let the heat out faster than the family could build it back. And the youngest had lost 3 toes to the frost before spring. Jed could name the dead and the maimed, the way a soldier names the battles, and he carried the weight of it in the set of his shoulders. And the weight was the thing that made him speak hard and speak plain, and not soften a warning to save a stranger's feelings. The frontier kept its own list. Kimiko kept working while he talked, and she didn't defend the build, because a stove that needs defending is a stove that hasn't yet earned the right to speak. She wedged the clay on the board like bread dough, pressing the air out of it with the heels of her hands, and she read the wetness of the mix by the sound it made when she thumped it with her open palm. She smoothed the dome in long single strokes with a wet hand, and the strokes didn't waver, and the surface came up, even under her fingers the way a sentence comes up, even under a steady voice. Hands did the talking. It was the kind of work that couldn't be fate. A man can talk his way past a bad fence or a crooked plank, but clay either holds or it doesn't, and the hands that shape it either know what they're doing or they don't, and there's no middle ground once the fire is lit. Jed had grown up around men who could shoe a horse or throw a rope or break a bronc, and he knew what competence looked like when he saw it. And the trouble was that he was seeing it now in a place he hadn't expected to see it, in the hands of a woman he'd already decided was a fool. That was the part that unsettled him most, and he didn't have a name for it yet. Jed had expected fumbling, a woman out of her depth in a country she didn't know, copying something she'd half remembered from home. He hadn't expected competence, and competence made him quiet for a beat, because competence is harder to argue with than pride. Tucker stood between his wife and his neighbor, and didn't intervene in either direction, and the silence he chose was its own kind of choice, the choice of a man who has decided to watch a thing fail, or hold before he bets on it. He would wait and see. Jed left with his arms still crossed, and he told Tucker on the way out that he'd come back when it cracked, and he said it the way a man says something he's certain of. Tucker walked Jed out to the horse, and neither of them said a word on the way, and the silence between them was heavier than the silence inside had been, because Jed had planted his flag, and Tucker hadn't picked a side, and a man who doesn't pick a side in a small valley has to live with both of them watching him. The dome was dry enough to fire by the next dawn, and Kimiko laid the first charcoal in the fire bowl as the light came up. The question of whether the clay would hold was about to be answered by the fire itself. Fire would have the last word. She built the heat slowly, the way a woman builds a fire in a cold clay stove, with the vent nearly closed and a small, clean charcoal flame that didn't ask too much of the dome at once. She knew, and Tucker learned by watching her face, that the thing which shatters a clay stove is a man in a hurry who throws a hot fire into a cold oven and expects it to be warm by morning. The clay had to cook before it could hold, and cooking takes patience, and patience was the one thing the frontier always ran short of. The dawn was cold, and the cabin was cold, and Tucker wanted heat then, but he watched her hold the fire down to a glow, and he kept his mouth shut, because he'd begun to trust her hands more than his own discomfort. Patience was the whole trick. A hairline crack opened near the top vent as the dome heated, a thin, dark line that ran 2 inches along the clay. Why? Tucker saw it before she did, and his stomach dropped. Because a crack in a clay stove is the first word of a sentence that ends in smoke and fire. She didn't panic and she didn't flinch, because a crack in the first firing was a thing her grandmother had taught her to expect, and expecting it was half of fixing it. She slaked the crack with a wet clay slip, mixed from the same clay as the dome, and she eased the top vent open a quarter turn to let the pressure breathe, and she let the stove find its own heat instead of forcing it. The fix was an old one. The crack sealed as the clay cooked, and the dome held. Silence filled the cabin after, the kind that comes when a man has been bracing for a sound, and the sound doesn't come. The fire burned clean for the rest of the morning, and the cabin filled with a dry, even heat that didn't smell of smoke or char the way the wall stove always had, and the difference was the kind a man feels before he can name it. Tucker sat forward on the bench after a while and held his hands out to the dome the way a man holds his hands to a campfire, and the heat reached him from 2 feet away without the stove throwing sparks or smoke or the sharp dry smell of iron cooling. He'd heated that room with the wall stove for 2 winters and never felt this because the iron stove threw its heat up the chimney as fast as it threw it into the room, and the clay stove kept its heat and gave it out slow. She set an iron pot of water on the top grid, and the water boiled faster than the wall stove had ever boiled it, on what looked like half the charcoal, and the steam came up clean and even and didn't smell of smoke. The wall stove had never come close. Tucker sat down on the bench and watched the steam, and didn't say anything for a long time, because the thing he'd been ready to call a fool's stove had just boiled his water on a handful of coals, and he didn't have a sentence for that yet. That evening, she cooked a pot of beans on the Kamado, and they cooked through in half the time the wall stove took on a quarter of the fuel, and the cabin stayed warm for 2 hours after she let the fire die down to embers. Tucker went to bed in a room that was still warm, and he woke in the small hours to a room that was still warm, and he lay there in the dark and listened to the silence of a house that was heating itself without him feeding it, and the silence was the thing that began to change his mind more than any argument could have. He let the stove make its own case. Jed came back that afternoon because he'd said he'd come back when it cracked, and he stood in the doorway and saw the pot boiling and the dome standing, and the cabin warm without a wall stove lit. He didn't say anything useful, only that the weather was holding, and he left. And the way he left was the tell, because a man who's been proven wrong doesn't stay to admire the proof. The easy test was over, and the hard one was still coming, and the first cold morning was only the first cold morning of a territory winter that hadn't yet begun to mean it. It would mean it soon enough, and what it would ask of the fool stove was a harder question than any of them had thought to ask. The hard question was still coming. November came in and the cold came with it. Not the polite cold of October, but the cold that means business, the kind that turns breath white at the kitchen door and freezes the water bucket by the porch before the sun is up. The cabin changed around the Kamado in ways Tucker hadn't planned. The sleeping rolls moved into a circle around the center, and the bed pushed to the wall. The iron stove against the north wall went cold and stayed cold, because no one needed it and no one wanted to feed it. It had a new heart. The Kamado sat in the middle of the room like a small dark sun, and the heat rolled off it in every direction at once, low and even, the kind of warmth that doesn't burn the side of a body that faces it and freeze the side that doesn't. Kerosene lamps threw their flickering amber light across the clay, and the light moved on the dome as the flame moved, and the room felt like a room instead of a shelter. The valley around them was burning wood as fast as it could split it, and smoke stood out of every chimney from dawn to dark, and the sound of axes carried across the creek all day, because an iron stove eats wood the way a hungry horse eats grain, and a frontier winter is long. All day the axes rang. Kimiko fired the Kamado once at dawn and once at dusk, and the heat held between the firings for hours after the charcoal was gone, because the clay had eaten the heat all day and was giving it back through the night. Tucker stopped splitting wood at midday the first week, because he had nothing left to feed, and the smallness of the pile in his wood box began to feel like a kind of magic he couldn't explain. The wood pile stopped shrinking. Across the creek, Jed was splitting a cord every 3 days, watching his woodpile shrink, and the smoke from his chimney never stopped, and the iron stove in his kitchen ate the work of his arms as fast as he could swing the axe. The whole valley was doing the same arithmetic, counting cords against weeks, and the arithmetic didn't balance for any of them, because a frontier winter is longer than a frontier woodpile. Kimiko's wood box held a fraction of what the others held, and her room was warmer than any of theirs, and the difference wasn't magic and it wasn't luck. It was clay and charcoal and a vent that knew how to breathe. And it was the memory of a grandmother who had taught her that a fire's job is not to burn hot, but to burn long. She had learned that lesson young. Then the trunk came open, and the room changed again. Kimiko lifted the lid on a Saturday afternoon when the wind was too strong to work outside, and Tucker saw what she'd carried across the ocean and kept shut against the wall for a month. Inside was a set of tea things wrapped in cloth, small roll of silk that held a row of needles so fine they caught no light from the lamp, and a worn paper sketch of a sunken hearth in the center of a Japanese room, and a orrery with a pot hanging above it on a hook. Tucker looked at the sketch for a long time, and for the first time since she'd marked the square on his floor, he understood what she'd been doing. He hadn't been improvising in a strange country or gambling on a guess, but rebuilding her grandmother's room in the only way the frontier would let her, trading a sunken hearth for a clay dome, trading a memory for a stove. The Kamado in the center of the cabin wasn't a foreign object in the wrong place. It was an orrery wearing the only shape the territory would allow, and the needles in their silk roll lay beside it, like a promise she hadn't yet had to keep. The sketch told the whole story. She left the roll on the shelf above the stove, where she could see it without reaching for it, because a woman who carries medicine carries it for the day she hopes won't come. And that day hadn't come yet, and the valley was still only cold. The valley had one more test coming, and it wasn't a test of the stove alone. It would test her, too. The barometer dropped on a Tuesday, and the sky went the color of a bruise. And by nightfall, the wind hit the cabin like something living and furious, carrying ice crystals that stung the windows and turned the world white in the space of an hour. The blizzard of 1883 didn't blow in and pass. It set down on the territory and stayed for 3 days, and then a fourth, and the snow heaped to the eaves, and the creek froze solid, and the road ceased to exist. Every chimney in the valley either drew smoke back into the room or froze out at the top, and the iron stoves that had been burning wood all autumn began to fail one by one, because a stove that eats wood fast also runs out of wood fast, and no one could get to the woodpile in the whiteout. Jed's own stove cracked a fire brick the first night, and the crack ran the length of the box, and the heat bled out of it faster than he could feed it, and his house dropped below freezing before the second dawn. Inside Kimiko's cabin, the temperature fell even with the Kamado lit, because the storm was pulling heat out through every wall and every gap in the roof, and there was no stove that could win against a wind like that on its own. The storm was winning. The cold came down through the roof and up through the floor, and in through every crack around the door, and the cabin that had felt like a room all autumn began to feel like a box set out in the middle of a frozen lake. Kimiko kept the Kamado fed with the small dry charcoal she'd stored in a lard tin by the door, and she kept the vents tuned to a breath, and the fire burned low and clean and steady while the storm screamed at the walls. Tucker nailed a horse blanket over the door and packed the window cracks with rags, and the two of them worked in silence, because the storm was too loud for talk, and the cold was too serious for talk, and the only thing worth saying was being said by the stove itself. They worked like a team by the second hour. Tucker and Kimiko banked the fire and hung quilts over the windows and the door, and waited. The waiting was the worst part, because the cold was winning, and they both knew it. There was nothing to do but wait. Then the Kamado did the thing that an iron stove can't do. Kimiko had charged it once at dusk with a single good firing, and by dawn the charcoal was gone, and the clay was still warm to the touch, and the room was still warm enough to breathe in. And Tucker laid his hand on the dome and felt the heat coming up out of it like a pulse. The clay was holding the fire's heat through the night, instead of letting it die, the way a stone holds the sun's heat past sundown, and that was the moment Tucker understood that the stove was doing something iron had never been able to do for him. By the third morning the charcoal was running low, and Kimiko rationed it the way a woman rations rice in a hard winter, a measured amount at dusk and no more, trusting the clay to carry the heat through the dark hours the way it had carried it the 2 nights before. The trust wasn't a gamble. It was the same her grandmother had put in the same kind of stove through 13 winters in a house that never let the cold inside, and the stove paid the trust back the way it always had, holding the warmth past dawn and into the gray light of a fourth day that no one in the valley had expected to be this hard. The fourth day brought the cost. Jed's daughter, Cora, was 7 years old and stubborn about it, and she slipped out of her father's cabin in the whiteout, looking for the barn cat that hadn't come in for 2 days. She made it 100 yards before the storm took her sense of direction, and she would have died in the snow if Jed hadn't seen the door open and gone out after her on foot. He found her half frozen and barely breathing, and the only light within reach was the amber glow coming through the cottonwoods from the window of Kimiko's cabin, and he carried her toward it because it was the only warm thing left in the valley. He came through Kimiko's door with the girl in his arms and his face broken open, expecting to be turned away, expecting to be too late, and the room was warm enough that the child's breath didn't fog when he laid her on the bench by the Kamado. The stove had been the fool's stove for 3 months, and now it was the only reason a frozen girl had a chance, and Jed knew it before he set her down. Hora's lips were blue, and her fingers were blue, and her breathing was shallow and slow, and Jed's voice broke when he said her name, and the breaking of his voice was the sound of a man who'd spent 3 months being certain he was right, meeting the moment where being right would have cost him his daughter. He had been wrong, and wrong almost killed her. Kimiko didn't ask permission, and she didn't hesitate, because a woman who's carried a roll of needles across an ocean has carried them for exactly this kind of moment, and the moment had arrived. She opened the lacquered trunk and took out the silk roll and the small box of dried herbs, and she knelt beside the bench where the girl lay gray and still, and she went to work. She didn't explain what she was doing, because explaining would have wasted the minutes the child had left. Every second counted. Now, Pius. She tapped a needle into the girl's wrist at a point her grandmother had taught her to find by the beat of the pulse, and the child's breathing shifted, slower and deeper, and the shift happened before anyone in the room could have told her what it meant. Jed watched her do it, and his hands stopped shaking before anyone told him his daughter was going to live, because his body knew, before his mind did, the way a man's body knows the moment a fever breaks. She boiled a bitter broth of dried herbs on the kamado and fed it to the girl a spoon at a time, and the color came back into Cora's face by the second spoon, and by the fourth she was crying, and the crying was the best sound any of them had heard in 3 days. The crying was the first sign she would live. None of it would have saved the girl if the room had been cold. The needles and the broth and the steady hands were half of it, and the heat rolling off the clay was the other half, and Kimiko knew, though she didn't say, that the medicine and the stove were the same act of keeping a child alive. The broth was made from dried roots and bark she'd carried from home, the kind of medicine her grandmother had measured out in a kitchen in Kyoto before she was born, and the bitter smell of it filled the cabin and mixed with the smell of the charcoal and the wet wool of Jed's coat. Tucker watched her work and didn't interfere because he'd learned by now that the things she carried in the lacquered trunk weren't souvenirs, and the woman who'd built his stove had other uses he hadn't yet seen. She worked for an hour without standing, and the hour was the quietest hour of the storm, and by the end of it Cora was sleeping a real sleep instead of the gray half-sleep of a child going cold. Jed stood in the center of the room when his daughter was breathing on her own, and he looked at the kamado for a long time, and the looking was the turn of the whole story. He didn't speak. He saw the heat rolling off the clay in every direction at once, reaching every wall of the room evenly, and the tin pipe barely trickling smoke because the clay was eating the heat before it could escape up the flue. Standing there, he understood that the center wasn't the wrong place for the stove, because the center was the only place the heat could reach every wall, and the clay wasn't the fragile thing he'd warned Tucker about, but the reason the room was still warm on the 4th day with a single fire. He'd been measuring her stove against his stoves, and she'd built something his stoves couldn't be, because his stoves were iron, and iron cools the moment the fire dies, and her stove was clay, and clay remembers. The wrong yardstick had cost him 3 months. The town had been wrong to laugh. And Jed knew it now in his bones, because his daughter was alive because of the thing he laughed at. The harder truth sat beside the easy one, and the story doesn't let a person rest in the easy one alone. Kimiko had risked the cabin and the marriage and her own life on a memory of a kitchen across the ocean, and it had paid off, and it could have not paid off, and a crack in the wrong place or a fire in the rafters would have proven Jed right and left her with nothing. She'd been reckless in the way that the careful people call reckless, and she'd been right in the way that the reckless people sometimes are, and both of those things were true at once, in the warm room where her stove held the cold at bay. She had gambled, and she had won. Jed didn't thank her that night, because the kind of debt he owed her wasn't the kind a man pays with a word, and a thank you spoken too soon would have cheapened it. He sat on the floor beside the bench where his daughter slept, and he watched the komedo, and he didn't leave until the storm broke, on the 5th morning, and he could carry Cora home in the daylight. Word would spread before the snow was off the road, because a story like that doesn't stay in one cabin in a small valley, and by the time the thaw came, the fool's stove had a different name in every mouth that said it. Silence had replaced the laughter. March pulled the snow back from the windows by inches, and the valley came up out of the white a piece at a time, the grass first, then the fences, then the road. The count of the winter was kind, all things considered. A few head of stock had died in the drifts, 2 chimneys had cracked under the freeze, and 1 cabin across the creek had a case of frostbitten feet that would heal by summer. No one had died, and the reason no one had died walked through Kimiko's door every morning carrying something. Jed brought the first wagon of creek clay to her cabin before the road was fully dry, and he didn't make a speech about it, because a man who's been wrong in the way Jed had been wrong doesn't pad the apology with words. He asked her in one short sentence whether she would build him one, and she said yes. And that was the whole of it. The other wagons followed within the week. Hank came with a load of clay, and his pride swallowed, and Blaze came after him. And the storekeeper, Garth, came last with the tin for the pipe, and they all stood where Jed had stood and waited to be shown. Kimiko built Jed's stove first, and she built it in a day, because the hands that had built one in a strange country could build another in a country that was becoming less strange, and Jed worked beside her mixing clay and hauling stone, and didn't tell her how to do any of it. The first firing of his Kamado cracked a vent seam, and she sealed it with a wet hand the way she'd sealed her own, and Jed watched her seal it and said nothing, because the crack had proven her right twice now, and the words a man says after that are fewer, not more. By the end of the month, there were 4 clay domes in the center of 4 cabins in Cottonwood Creek, and the smoke from the valley thinned, and the wood piles held, and the sound of axes stopped carrying all day across the creek. 4 cabins now heated the old way. Kimiko didn't lecture them, and she didn't say the words that would have let them off easy, because a woman who's won doesn't need to say she's won. She walked the floor of each cabin in the valley, marked the center square with charcoal, and started, and her hands knew the work as well as they'd ever known it. The trunk stayed open now, and the worn sketch of the Aurora leaned against the wall where she could see it while she worked, and the memory had become the blueprint for a whole valley. The memory had outlasted the ocean. Tucker was the one who changed the most in the end, though he'd have been the last to say so. He carried clay for her without being asked, and he stopped introducing her as the woman he'd sent for, and the day he called her his wife to Jed in front of the store, plainly and without ceremony, was the day the story had really been building toward all along. The foreigner had become the center of the valley, the same way the stove had become the center of the cabin, by being the thing that everyone gathered around when there was nowhere else to go. Jed's daughter Cora ran the fence line that sprang on legs that worked, and she came to Kimiko's cabin every Saturday with a tin of creek clay her father had dug, and she sat on the floor and watched Kimiko's hands, and the watching was the real payoff of the story, though none of them would have said so. A skill passed across a kitchen floor is a thing that outlasts a winter, and the woman who'd been the China woman on the store porch was now the woman the valley sent its daughters to learn from, and the distance between those 2 names was the whole distance of the tale. She never asked for the name back. The first cold night of the next autumn, every cabin in Cottonwood Creek showed a single glow at its center, and a stranger riding through would have thought the valley had always heated itself that way. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button if it moved you.